This presentation, titled Introducing the ISO Technical Committee for Occupational Health and Safety Management, ISO TC 283, comes to us from Martin Cottam and Sally Swingwood. Martin Cottam is a Group Technical Assurance and Quality Director with overall responsibility for quality management and technical governance across Lloyd's Register, one of the world's leading providers of professional services for engineering and technology. Martin has contributed to the development of OH&S management system standards, including OSIS 18001 and ISO 45001, and the ISO 55000 series on asset management. He chaired the BSI Mirror Committee throughout the development of ISO 45001, leading the UK delegation on the ISO 45001 Project Committee. He now chairs the ISO Technical Committee for Occupational Health and Safety Management, ISO TC 283, which owns ISO 45001 and is developing additional standards and guidance on OH&S management. Sally Swingwood is BSI's lead standards development manager for business improvement and occupational health and safety management. She's responsible for working with both national and international experts to develop documents that help organizations of all types improve the way they operate and to better protect the people who work for them. Sally is the manager of the ISO TC 283, the technical committee responsible for the world's first international standard on occupational health and safety management, ISO 45001. She's actively involved in the development of ISO 45003, guidance on psychological health and safety at work, and will also be the first globally agreed standard of its type. And with that, take it away, Sally and Martin.
Thank you very much, Michael. Just a brief look at today's agenda, very simple. We are going to introduce you to ISO TC 283, look at our current and future activities and publications, and offer you opportunities to input to our work, make the most of our work, and to get involved. Martin, would you like to say something about our committee?
Thank you, Sally, and hello, everyone. ISO Technical Committee 283 is responsible for developing standards for occupational health and safety management, aimed at supporting organisations of all sizes, sectors and locations, and to help those organisations to drive improvement in OHS performance. On the slide you're seeing now, you will also see that we've included the icons which represent the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It's important to recognise that ISO relates its work very strongly to the aspirations of the United Nations, and the work of our committee contributes particularly to the fulfilment of two of those goals related to health and well-being and decent work and economic growth. The slide also gives you a small image showing the members of the committee assembled late last year in Kigali, Rwanda, and that gives you a sense of the size of the committee. There are around about 100 of us clustered into that photograph. Moving on to the next slide, where I'll talk a little bit about committee membership. You can see here that we have currently 78 countries who are actively participating in our work, and a further 21 countries who are involved as observers. And I should also remark that we have around about 10 organisations, international organisations, which are involved as liaisons to the committee. That includes, for example, professional organisations, including the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health, IOSH, but it also includes employer organisations and labour organisations. And we maintain active liaisons with quite a large number of other ISO technical committees whose work is relevant to us and vice versa. Now, of course, our committee, like all ISO committees, and indeed really like the whole of mankind, has been significantly affected by the current pandemic and has had to adapt its ways of working. As many of you will know, the traditional way of operating in ISO committees and in standards development relies very heavily on physical meetings. And our committee, which has existed since 2018, when ISO 45001 was first published, and the project committee which wrote that standard was transformed into the current technical committee, a permanent committee to manage OHS. Our committee since 2018 has had 3 physical meetings, as indicated on the slide, in the UK, the US, and in Rwanda. But we now face the prospect of working virtually for the foreseeable future. And so a planned meeting in Mexico earlier this year was replaced by a virtual meeting. And similarly, our plans to meet in El Salvador next month have again required us to transform our plans into those for a physical meeting, for a virtual meeting. And that brings its own challenges when we have colleagues dispersed across more or less every time zone on the planet. But certainly our experience in May was very positive, and certainly we are optimistic that the work of our committee will continue unaffected by the current situation. So with that, back to you, Sally.
Thanks, Martin. So I'd just like to go over what our objectives are in TC 283. And essentially, it is to publish formal and informal documents to support improvements in OHS performance in all types of organisations, whether they are large multinationals or 2- and 3-person small businesses. And that includes the implementation of ISO 45001, but it is not exclusive to it. One of the areas of work that we do is to identify trends and challenges in effective OHS management and develop material to help drive improvement. We like to engage with our users as much as possible to gather feedback, to understand where the issues are, to prioritise what we're working on next, raise awareness of the work, but also to inform how our standards may challenge users, where they may not be good enough, where they may be unclear and need clarity adding to them. So we're doing a lot of engagement work to try and make sure we can really understand how the standards are used and if they're being effective. And this increasingly is involving developing the specific materials to promote ISO 45001 and OHS management generally in smaller companies. Martin, would you like to explain the current structure of the committee to people?
Thank you, Sally. It was an awful lot easier to explain the structure of the committee 2 years ago when we were first in formation, because this diagram was a great deal simpler. And it's a reflection, I think, of the importance of this work area, that we've seen such a rapid escalation in the scale of our activity. And that's illustrated by the organisation chart that you can see now. I'll talk to part of this, but some of it will become clearer when we work through the individual work items, which are our current work programme. But explaining it briefly, at the top, you see the overall umbrella of the technical committee itself, with Sally and my names there in the box. And at the bottom, you see a cluster of 5 working groups, 4 currently in existence, and the one with the dotted line expected to be formed within the coming year. They represent the groups which actually do the work of developing the deliverables, about which we'll hear more in just a moment as we continue this presentation. But in between, you can see a cluster of boxes representing task groups, and I'll just briefly explain what those are. These are the groups which support the activities of the committee, including the activities of all its working groups. They are, if you like, permanent groups. You can see perhaps on the left, there is one focused on communications. Sally's already made the point of how important to us outreach and engagement is with interested parties and users of the standards. And the maintenance of our website and that communication effort is focused through our communications group. Beneath it, we have a group which contains specialists with knowledge of terminology who help us to make sure that we use terminology consistently across all our deliverables and work very hard on crafting the definitions which appear in the front of standards, but which are often perhaps not fully appreciated by the user, but often very much appreciated, of course, by auditors because of the clarity that that helps to bring. Beneath it, you'll see a group which is our focus for this committee's input to the ongoing revision of Annex SL, the high-level text and common structure which underpins all management system standards, and which I'm sure will be very familiar to many people involved in management system auditing. And then over to the right, we have a Chair's Advisory Group, which works with Sally and myself on the steering of the committee, a Spanish translation task force, which helps with that important aspect of making sure that our documents are accessible in the Spanish language in particular. Of course, documents get translated into many other languages too. And recently, we have established a developing countries coordination group to make sure that as a committee, we really understand and promote the full and active participation in our work of the representatives of developing countries so that their voice is fully heard alongside everyone else. And then finally, the dotted lines, dotted box on the left-hand side of the stack is a task group that we expect to form within coming months, which will do some preliminary work ahead of the revision of ISO 45001 itself. And Sally will touch more on our plans for that revision shortly. So with that, back to you, Sally.
Thanks, Martin. As Martin mentioned, we are just beginning to look at preliminary work for a revision of ISO 45001. As you know, that originally published in March 2018. So it will be 3 years in March next year, and that would have been the end of the transition period from 18001 had we not had a global pandemic. That transition period, as I'm sure you're aware, has now been slightly extended. But because it takes such a long time to develop a standard, particularly a standard on occupational health and safety, which is understood very differently in different parts of the world, and different parts of the world have more mature systems for managing it than others, we believe it is wise to start the preliminary work and possibly the revision earlier than would be the standard 5-year review cycle to question whether we need to update this standard. If we were, for example, to begin work in 2021, it's very unlikely we will publish before 2024. And that is a long time. The world is changing very quickly. So this is part of why we currently have an ISO 45001 user survey out to get feedback from the people on the ground who are actually implementing it in their organizations. And we're also doing research into various challenges that are being raised by the 99 countries that are involved in our work at the moment, to see if there's anything that we should be putting into 45001 that isn't there at the moment, or perhaps requirements that might need strengthening or more clarity. We have just published a practical guide, a handbook for how small organisations can implement ISO 45001. This was done in liaison with UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial, Martin, help me out here.
Industrial Development Organization.
Thank you very much. So UNIDO worked with ISO and us to help us write this low-cost guide to implementing ISO 45001. And we very much hope that that will help reduce poor performance in smaller businesses, which has a very large impact on those small businesses across the world. The other standard that we are very well into development of is ISO 45003, which will provide guidelines on psychological health and safety in the workplace. This will be the first standard of its type, global standard of its type, and it will support ISO 45001. It is written to support it, not to establish a separate management system standard. It's not designed for any schemes or for certification, but it will be informing those organisations who are looking for certification on ISO 45001. This standard is currently out for public comment. That closes in November, and we are hoping to publish next summer. We are also working on a general implementation guidance document, ISO 45002, which will go further than the handbook for small businesses. This will include practical advice for all sorts of organisations, from large organisations to the very small, the complex to the simple, and cover the different types of sectors. For example, the service sector has very different needs often to a manufacturing sector or a chemical industry. So that is under development at the moment. We are hoping to publish that in the middle of 2022 or thereabouts. We're also just beginning to work on the bottom one on the slide, ISO PAS 45005. Now, this is a rapid response, as rapid as we can make it, to the COVID-19 pandemic that we have all been experiencing this year and the ongoing challenges, especially economic challenges. How do you keep your businesses going without compromising health and safety of your workers and also your customers and your supply chain? So we are developing this standard, which began work very recently at speed, in the hope that we can publish something which is useful to those countries and those organisations that do not have guidance by the end of 2020. We're aware this is a dynamic situation. We will review it and revise it if we need to, as quickly as we are able to. Again, there are challenges involved in this. I think we currently have around 60 countries involved in the development of this guidance, all of which have slightly differing guidance in their own countries or in their own sectors. So what we are trying to achieve is something comprehensive, globally applicable, generally good, trusted advice that has been tested and validated by real experts, people like the World Health Organization, for example. The other standard, which we will be discussing this autumn and hopefully putting to ballot later this year, is a guidance standard on performance evaluation. We're all aware of organisations that manage to implement their management system standards and they meet requirements, but their performance doesn't really improve the way they had hoped it to. And part of this is people don't always know how best to measure, how best to monitor, how to put in indicators that help them drive improvement rather than just recognise where something has gone wrong or there has been a failure. So that is a very big piece of work, which is just about to begin. And we expect that we'll probably publish in around 2024. On the screen now is a rough overview of our project timelines. As I'm sure you understand, when you are working with many countries and many stakeholders, we have a lot of ballots for approval or disapproval. This means timelines like this have to be flexible. These are anticipated dates that show when certain stages are met and when we hope to publish. Of course, that is all very dependent on the conveners of each of the working groups performing an excellent job in reaching consensus and persuading those countries that are participating to approve what is going forward before it goes to the wider member ballot. But these are our rough timelines, and as you can see, I think we will be very busy for the next 3 years. And as Martin mentioned when he was discussing the structure, the work of this committee is only increasing, and situations like this year's crisis really underpin how important it is to get health and safety at the foundation of all of our work. Martin.
Thank you, Sally. So now, a little bit about your chance to get involved and indeed a request that as many people as possible who hear this, view this presentation, actually consider doing so, because the whole process of standards and everything that ISO is trying to achieve is about an open and transparent process that is accessible to people. And the real strength of the standards that ISO develops comes from the breadth and diversity of the inputs which are provided to shape those standards. And of course, those who are involved in auditing have a particularly strong understanding, I would suggest, partly speaking as an auditor myself, of standards and of their practical application. So feedback and insight from those who have that mindset and approach as auditors and that experience is hugely valuable. To tell us for existing standards what works and what doesn't, what's unclear, what actually needs strengthening if the standard is to be effective in driving performance improvement, or are there areas where the standard is too onerous or the requirements are just not adding value? All that is valuable feedback when we think about future revisions of standards, and all that is valuable feedback into the drafting of new standards, including the guidance documents which Sally's been talking about in the last few minutes. So there are a number of ways in which you can be involved. The most obvious, of course, is to comment on our documents as they emerge and go through the various cycles and stage gates, which includes public consultation, which is organised through national standards bodies, most of whom maintain a mirror committee, which is a focal point for assembling the national view. So there'll be many opportunities to comment on documents via your national standards body as a user, a member of the public, an interested party. You'll also see that we carry out surveys which are publicised through social media and through our own website. Sally's just mentioned the fact that we have the 45,001 user survey going on at the moment. And I would expect that we'll make use of further surveys as part of that work we're speaking about, the preparatory work for the revision of 45,001, because the more inputs we can have to shape our thinking about what that revision might look like and what we need to address in that revision, the better it will be. For those who are interested perhaps to go further, of course, it's really important to all national standards bodies that they themselves can represent a broad range of stakeholder views, and that's where the national mirror committees come into play. And I'm sure there are opportunities to participate in national mirror committees for those who are interested to do so. Certainly we in the UK are always keen to hear from people who would be willing and able to participate in those activities, and I'm sure that's replicated around the world. And of course, if you were to get involved in that way, you might indeed find yourself with the opportunity to represent your national standards body in the task groups and working groups of TC 283 that we've been describing to you in the course of this presentation. So I hope you'll consider what is best for you in terms of the opportunity to input to our process. But I would very much like to hope and encourage that the insights which many of you will have from your audit work, that's really valuable information, and we would love to hear from you. Now on the screen now, you can also see the address for our committee's own website, which I referred to, and indeed the contact details for Sally as committee manager.
Thank you, Martin.
And that concludes our presentation, I think. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching.
Well, thank you, Martin Cottam and Sally Swingwood, for your combined insight into the inner workings of ISO TC 283 the technical committee responsible for the ISO 45001 Occupational Health and Safety Standard. And that concludes this presentation.